Okay, so when you think about the history of ideas
Mm-hmm.
and uh, as someone with a philosophy background,
Right.
you might have like a certain image of when the really like philosophically fertile periods were.
Yeah.
And so like the Middle Ages, uh, I think it can be easy to kind of just like lump that all together and be like, oh, that was
Yeah.
the Dark Ages, just dominated by religious thought.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a common perception for sure.
Yeah.
Understandable given, how that period has been portrayed quite often.
Yeah, and we're going to challenge that assumption today as we do a deep dive into medieval political philosophy.
Okay.
And more specific, it's a
Yeah.
huge topic. So we're going to be focusing on roughly 900 to 1400 AD
Oh, great.
and spanning across the Western Christian,
Right.
Jewish, and Islamic worlds.
Okay.
So,
For you with your,
yeah.
philosopher's toolkit, this is really going to be like, a laser-focused exploration. We've distilled the source material down to like the real core insights.
Yeah.
The sophisticated political theorizing that was happening in this period,
Yeah.
often in ways that you might not expect. So get ready for some aha moments as we unpack this.
Yeah, because, the sources that we looked at really dismantle that Dark Ages narrative, I think.
Yeah.
They reveal just like this, huge amount of intellectual energy devoted to these really fundamental questions like law power
Mm-hmm.
and how religion and politics relate to each other.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that these three intellectual traditions
Right.
that
Yeah.
we're talking about, they're not isolated. They're like
Oh, no.
interconnected.
Yeah, very much in dialogue with each other,
Yeah.
influencing each other.
Yeah.
And all drawing upon and building upon that foundation
Yeah.
of ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
So a really fascinating period.
Yeah. So our mission in this deep dive is very clear.
Okay.
We're going to try to extract
Yeah.
the most interesting,
Yes.
compelling, relevant
Yeah.
insights
Yeah.
from all of this source material for, well,
Right.
a philosophical mind like yours.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Our goal is to
Yeah.
demonstrate that medieval political philosophy is not just like a transitional phase
yeah.
between, antiquity and the Renaissance. It's
Right.
a rich,
Yeah.
dynamic field of thought that deserves like serious consideration alongside
Yeah.
classical and post-medieval political philosophy.
Okay. So I think a good place to start is unpacking this idea of the Dark Ages itself.
Yeah.
Even just the term Middle Ages has a kind of a judgment built into it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole periodization of history often comes with like, underlying value judgments. You're saying
Yeah.
it's in the middle.
Yeah.
It suggests it's merely a kind of intermediary period
Yeah.
between the perceived heights of classical antiquity
Right.
and then the Renaissance.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, it potentially like overshadows its own unique contributions.
It's kind of like a
Yeah.
backwater or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like we're just waiting for the real action to happen again.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the reality is far more complex. And as our sources highlight,
Right.
intellectual life did not just like vanish after the fall of the Western Roman Empire.
Yeah. Yeah.
We still have the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium,
Right.
which continues to preserve and study
Yeah.
those vital Greek classics.
Yeah. And I think that's something that can get lost, in our telling of it in the West.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of like, oh, Rome fell, and then,
Yeah.
everything went dark.
Yeah.
But, Byzantium is a major force.
Right.
And another thing that's often underappreciated in the West
Yeah.
is the really crucial role of the Islamic world
Yeah.
during this period.
Yeah.
They initiated this massive translation movement,
Yeah.
safeguarding and translating the works of Plato and Aristotle, thinkers who were largely inaccessible in the Christian West at that time.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating to trace this kind of intellectual lineage, from Greek
Yeah.
to Syriac,
Yeah.
then to Arabic, and then later back into Europe through translations from Arabic, Hebrew, and Greek.
Yeah.
It's just this amazing journey of
Yeah.
these.
It's a testament to the enduring power
Yeah.
of these philosophical ideas
Yeah.
and their journey across cultures.
Yeah. So John of Salisbury, who we'll be talking about more later,
Yeah.
he kind of captures this beautifully in the 12th century
Yeah.
with that metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
So even when there wasn't direct access to, all the texts,
Yeah.
there was still this clear recognition of the intellectual debt that was owed to earlier thinkers.
Absolutely. Yeah. He saw himself very much as part of this tradition,
Yeah.
building upon what came before.
Okay, so this clearly was not an intellectual vacuum,
No.
right? So what kinds of questions were these medieval political philosophers asking? What was the scope of their philosophical inquiry?
Yeah, so what you find is that they grappled with many of like the perennial questions that still concern political philosophers today.
Okay.
What constitutes a just political order?
Hmm.
What's the proper relationship between the individual and the state?
Hmm.
They wrestled with issues of violence, corruption,
Right.
and, the ever-present problem of the abuse of authority.
Yeah, so timeless questions, but considered within
Yeah.
like a very different context,
Right.
right? Shaped by, things like the influence of revealed religion.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's huge.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
And then the ongoing impact of those Greek and Roman ideas,
Yeah.
and then the development of just like entirely new social and political structures.
Exactly. And these unique contextual elements led to like really distinctive philosophical approaches.
Yeah.
And it's important for, as a philosopher to recognize that their thought had like a lasting impact.
Right.
I mean, many of the concepts of law, government, liberty.
Rights that we value today,
Oh.
have roots that extend all the way back to these medieval sources.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dig into some of the differences
Okay.
and similarities between like the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic worlds.
Okay.
During this time,
Oh, yeah.
the source material mentions the Golden Age of Islam.
Yeah.
So can you describe the political and intellectual landscape there a bit?
Yeah. So the Golden Age, roughly, we're talking about 8th to the 14th centuries,
Right.
saw the Islamic world as like this major cultural, political, economic power.
Yeah.
Within this vast region, you have various political entities emerging from, large caliphates to smaller city-states.
Right.
But importantly, philosophy became a crucial tool for reflecting on the nature and organization of the Ummah,
Yeah.
the community of believers, the role of religious law, Sharia, and the ideal qualities of a ruler.
Right. And they were drawing inspiration from thinkers like.
Well, so they often drew inspiration from Plato's
Okay.
concept of the philosopher king.
Right. But filtered through Neoplatonism
Yeah.
and integrated with Islamic ideas about the prophet
Right.
and the imam.
Okay, so you have this kind of like blending of different,
Yeah, a synthesis
Yeah.
of different intellectual traditions.
yeah, and we see Jewish thinkers
Yes.
living in these Islamic lands
Yeah.
and Christian lands,
Mm-hmm.
also reflecting on political life
Right.
through a philosophical lens.
Absolutely. So they too utilized philosophical tools
Yeah.
to try to understand the implications of their divine law,
Okay.
which is known as halakha and jurisprudence.
And it's interesting, I mean, as a philosopher thinking about this,
Yeah.
is political philosophy even the right term for this?
That's a great question. And actually, there's significant scholarly discussion about this. I
All right.
mean, is it accurate to call this political philosophy?
Yeah.
Given that there's this profound intertwining of metaphysics, theology, and philosophy in these intellectual systems.
Yeah. So it's not as kind of neatly compartmentalized as we might think about philosophy today.
Right, exactly. However, the pervasive influence of late Platonism and Neoplatonism does provide a common framework for discussing, genuine political ideas,
Okay.
even within this kind of religious framework. So you'll see ideas of law, human sociability, governance being discussed within these traditions.
Okay. And what about the Western Middle Ages?
Yeah,
The source material mentions like a first European revolution
yeah,
around 1000 AD.
yeah.
What was going on politically there that might have shaped?
Yeah, that's a really interesting period because it witnesses like significant social,
Okay.
political, economic, religious, cultural transformations.
Wow.
I mean, we see the consolidation of regional kingdoms,
Probably.
evolving institutional structures,
Mm-hmm.
the development of vernacular languages alongside this kind of post-classical Latin,
Right.
and crucially, the emergence of more formalized legal systems, often drawing inspiration from Roman law, but also developing their own characteristics.
Okay.
And then, of course, the gradual rediscovery
Right.
and study of classical texts, particularly the works of Aristotle,
Yeah.
starting in the 13th century.
Yeah.
This is huge
Yeah.
because it provides new intellectual tools for analyzing political life.
And I mean, these texts weren't just, curiosities. They were immediately relevant
Yeah.
to the political situation, right?
Absolutely, because this is a period of widespread disputes over the sources and limits of political authority.
Okay.
So you have conflict between the church and secular rulers, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor,
Right.
and even within secular kingdoms themselves.
Yeah.
So all of this conflict acts as like a major catalyst
Okay.
for philosophical reflection
Makes sense.
on the nature of power, justice,
Yeah.
and the best forms of government.
So given all of this context, what were some of the defining characteristics of medieval political philosophy?
Yeah, so two main features I think stand out for a philosopher's consideration. First, it's like this dynamic and intricate interplay between theoretical, theological, and practical concerns.
Yeah.
Always with a keen awareness of specific political realities
Yep.
and ideological interests.
So it's not just like happening in a vacuum.
No, not at all. These thinkers are constantly engaging
Yeah.
with, classical texts, theological doctrines, the concrete political situations they're observing.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Byzantine scholars are using Aristotle to analyze and legitimize imperial power.
Okay.
Whereas in the West, the rediscovery of Aristotle's politics provides a new framework
Right.
for, analyzing existing regimes, for critiquing or defending different forms of government.
Okay.
As we see, for example, in Marsilius of Padua's arguments against the Pope's claim to, plenitudo potestatis.
Right. So there's like a real kind of engagement
Yeah,
with these texts, but also with their own political realities.
absolutely. It's not just, abstract theorizing. It's very much grounded in,
The world they're living in?
Okay. And we see this in Jewish and Islamic thought as well.
Exactly. They're drawing on these classical ideas to understand their own traditions,
Yeah.
their own political and legal traditions.
Okay. So the second key feature then.
Yeah. The second key feature is the close,
Yeah.
an often inseparable connection between political philosophy and ethical analysis.
Okay.
So Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics
Mm-hmm.
was widely read and commented upon across all three of these intellectual traditions.
Interesting.
So political philosophy was often conceived as like this practical science, deeply concerned with ethical rules and actions within a political community.
Right.
And you even have some thinkers drawing an analogy with medicine.
Okay.
So they're seeing ethics as like the theoretical understanding of human flourishing,
Okay.
and then politics as the practical application
Right.
of that understanding to the health of the body politic.
So political philosophy isn't just about these abstract theories of the state.
It's like really grounded in questions of like how we should live.
Exactly. It's about
Right.
the good life.
Yeah.
How individuals ought to live and act
Yeah.
within a just political order.
And then even within the Christian Latin world, there's a debate about the status of practical philosophy.
Yes.
So,
Ethics and politics.
Yeah.
In relation to theoretical sciences like metaphysics.
right.
So commentators are grappling with, questions about the relationship between scientia moralis,
Right.
moral science,
Yeah.
scientia civilis, which is civil science or political science,
Yeah.
their epistemic status,
Yeah.
and their connection to prudentia,
Okay.
practical wisdom.
So their relationship to action.
Yeah, exactly. So some thinkers like Peter of Auvergne and John Buridan,
Hmm.
they draw distinctions between political science as this form of knowledge
Okay.
and then the contingent nature of actual political action.
Mhm.
Whereas others, like Marsilius, actually argue that political science can achieve a level of certainty comparable to metaphysics,
Okay.
what he termed apodictic status.
Okay, so let's talk about some individuals
Okay.
who really shaped medieval political philosophy.
Sounds good.
You mentioned Al-Farabi as a foundational figure
Yeah.
in the Islamic world.
Yes, he's really a key figure.
What were some of his core ideas?
Yeah. So Al-Farabi living, in the 9th and 10th centuries,
Okay.
he really establishes this framework for Islamic political thought.
Okay.
So he famously proposes this hierarchical relationship between philosophy and religion.
Okay.
He argues that philosophy,
Yeah.
as this pursuit of rational knowledge of first principles,
Okay.
represents the highest form of understanding
Okay.
and the path to true happiness.
Okay, so philosophy is superior to...
In terms of its intellectual content,
Okay.
yes.
Right.
But religion plays this indispensable practical role
Okay.
in the political sphere.
Okay.
He sees it as a more accessible,
Absolutely.
imaginative representation of these same truths that are essential for guiding the non-philosophical majority
Okay.
towards virtuous action and social order.
So philosophy for the elite.
in a sense.
Yeah, a religion for the masses.
Yes.
Okay.
But not in a way that's dismissive of religion.
Right.
He sees religion as absolutely essential for social and political life.
Okay. And the ideal ruler then?
Yes. The ideal ruler for Al-Farabi is a philosopher king or prophet, an individual who has attained both moral and intellectual perfection. And effectively synthesizing Greek philosophical ideals with Islamic prophetic tradition.
So very much like bringing together these two traditions.
Absolutely.
And so where does political science fit into this?
So he places political science at the apex of his classification of the sciences, even above metaphysics. He considers it to encompass both theology, which is kalam, and jurisprudence, which is fiqh. So for him, political science has this theoretical dimension concerned with universal principles of good governance.
But also a practical dimension aimed at, like, achieving human perfection and the well-being of the political community.
So both the theory and the application.
Absolutely.
And this idea of intellectual happiness.
Yes.
How did he see that being achieved?
So he believed that true intellectual happiness is attained through, like, the exercise of reason. And ultimately through conjunction with what he calls the active intellect. But recognizing that not everyone is capable of achieving this level of philosophical understanding. He argues that religion serves as this, like, symbolic and persuasive means of conveying essential moral and political truths to the masses. So these beliefs, while expressed through, like, you know, imaginative representations rather than pure reason, can still guide people towards virtuous conduct and, you know, participating in this pursuit of happiness.
So they're still aiming at the same end, just through a different route.
Exactly. Different paths to the same ultimate goal. Okay. And it's interesting that Al-Farabi's enumeration of sciences, which, you know, laid out this view of knowledge, had some influence in the Christian West.
A limited influence. But still fascinating. You see potential impact on thinkers like Roger Bacon, Dante, and even Marsilius. So it shows these connections, these cross-cultural intellectual connections.
Okay, so let's turn to Latin West. And talk about John of Salisbury.
Sounds good.
A key figure in the 12th century. So what was his major work?
His major work is the Polycraticus. And it's considered the first comprehensive work of medieval Latin political philosophy.
So this is a big deal.
This is a major text.
What are some of the themes that it explores?
So it's a vast treatise that lays out, like, you know, moral and political standards for evaluating government. With a big emphasis on the ethical responsibilities of rulers and the importance of wise counsel. He famously uses this analogy of the political community as a human body with different parts. Like the priesthood is the soul, the king is the head, each fulfilling essential functions for the well-being of the whole.
So this idea that, like, you know...
interdependence.
Everyone has their role to play.
Each part has its role.
And does this come from, like, a theological perspective?
Well, it's very much grounded in this idea of natural order and the idea that, like, the health of the political community depends on each part fulfilling its divinely ordained role in harmony with the others, serving both earthly order and eternal salvation.
And was he drawing on other thinkers to kind of...
Oh, absolutely. Like many medieval thinkers, he relies heavily on earlier authorities, both pagan and Christian. So you'll find scripture in there. The church fathers, classical thinkers like Cicero. Even though direct access to Cicero's political treatises was somewhat limited. At the time, he also weaves in a lot of references to Latin poets.
Interesting.
So this reliance on established authorities is a hallmark of medieval intellectual discourse.
So given the kind of sprawling nature of the Polycraticus, what would you say are, like, some of its key philosophical contributions?
One of the most interesting things is his perspective on the relationship between secular and spiritual powers. So he wasn't a strict advocate for the church's control over, like, temporal affairs. He actually argued for a degree of autonomy for secular government,
Okay.
recognizing a distinct common good.
Okay.
That's the primary responsibility of rulers
Yep.
in the temporal realm,
Okay.
while still acknowledging the ultimate spiritual ends
Okay.
set by the priesthood.
So there is some distinction there.
Yeah, a kind of nuanced
Yeah.
view.
Yeah.
He also emphasizes the active role of individuals in pursuing earthly happiness within a natural framework,
Yeah.
highlighting the importance of, experience, practical skill, knowledge, virtue, both at the individual and societal levels for achieving this flourishing political community.
And moving forward a bit in time, we have Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes,
Yes.
in Al-Andalus.
Yeah, another towering figure
Yeah.
in medieval Muslim philosophy.
And best known for his commentaries on Aristotle.
Right.
How did his engagement with Aristotle inform his political thought?
Yeah, so Ibn Rushd achieved immense influence
Right.
in both the Islamic and Christian world
Wow.
through these detailed commentaries on Aristotle.
Okay.
And while his work on metaphysics and psychology, has some indirect implications for his political views,
Yeah.
his main contributions to political philosophy stem from his commentaries on the Nicomachean Ethics
Okay.
and Plato's Republic.
Okay, and why the Republic?
Well, because Aristotle's politics was not available to him.
Oh, okay, so he's using the Republic as a kind of,
Yeah, as a substitute.
stand-in.
For the
instead of
polity,
replicate.
yeah. And he explicitly acknowledges this
Oh.
in his writings.
Okay.
And he uses Plato's work as his primary source for understanding the ideal state.
Okay.
So he views both ethics and politics as these practical sciences,
Okay.
concerned with guiding action and dealing with contingent matters
Okay.
rather than necessary truths
Right.
of theoretical philosophy.
Okay.
He actually draws a parallel between these practical sciences and medicine,
Okay.
with ethics analyzing human character and habits,
Okay.
and politics examining how those habits can be cultivated and perfected to achieve human flourishing within a political community.
So very much focused on the practical side of things.
Very much so.
Okay.
Very much so.
And so his commentary on the Republic
Yeah.
would have touched on, Plato's ideas about justice and the ideal state and the philosopher king.
Exactly.
Did his interpretations have an impact beyond the Islamic world?
They did. They actually had a significant impact in the Christian West,
Wow.
particularly among those who favored a more rationalistic approach to philosophy
Okay.
and who might have been critical of certain ecclesiastical claims.
Yeah.
Thinkers like Dante and Marsilius of Padua, who we'll talk about later, were influenced by his ideas.
Okay.
Now, the extent to which we can speak of a unified political Averroist tradition is still a matter of debate among scholars.
Okay. So his influence is there, but it's kind of,
It's complex.
yeah, hard to pin down. Exactly.
Exactly. It's a subject of ongoing research.
Okay, let's talk about Moses Maimonides,
Okay.
a leading figure in Jewish thought.
Yes. A major figure.
How did he bring together philosophy and politics?
Yeah, so Maimonides is really interesting because he's this Jewish philosopher
Right.
who lived in both Islamic and Christian territories.
Right, so kind of crossing those boundaries.
Exactly. And he sought to harmonize Greek Neoplatonism,
Okay.
largely as it was transmitted through Islamic thinkers like Al-Farabi,
Okay.
with the principles of Jewish divine law.
Okay, so very much kind of bringing these different traditions into conversation.
Absolutely, a real synthesis
Yeah.
of different strands of thought.
Yeah, and so where is his political philosophy most clearly seen?
Well, his political philosophy is most clearly articulated in his Guide of the Perplexed,
Yeah.
although you can find elements of it in some of his earlier works as well.
Okay.
And he defines political science quite broadly, encompassing not just the governance of the city,
Okay.
but also the proper management of the household,
Right.
and even the individual self-governance.
Yeah.
So for Maimonides, the ultimate aim of political life,
Yeah.
guided by divine law and philosophical understanding,
Yeah.
was to lead individuals and the community towards true happiness,
Okay.
which he sees as primarily intellectual flourishing.
Okay, so there's this connection then between the ethical life of the individual
Absolutely.
and the political community.
Yeah, he sees them as intimately connected,
Yep.
all ultimately directed towards this intellectual fulfillment.
And this goal of intellectual fulfillment, how did he see that being achieved?
Well, being a good Aristotelian,
Yeah.
he recognized the importance of material well-being,
Okay.
social interaction as necessary conditions for intellectual pursuits.
Okay.
But he differs somewhat from some Islamic philosophers who emphasize the solitary nature of the philosopher.
Okay.
Maimonides actually argues for the philosopher's responsibility to guide the masses towards intellectual truths, albeit often through like this more accessible framework of religious belief and law. So he envisions the ideal leader as this figure who combines philosophical wisdom, prophetic insight, and the authority of law. A philosopher, prophet, lawmaker.
Right, so bringing together these different roles.
Yeah, a very unique synthesis.
Yeah.
And he sees this figure as someone who can effectively communicate profound truths to those less capable of like rigorous philosophical inquiry through the power of, imagination and religious symbolism.
Okay, and the sources mention this debate about the status of political philosophy in Maimonides' work.
Yes.
And in medieval Jewish thought.
Yeah, and this is a crucial point for a philosopher to appreciate.
Yeah.
So in the Jewish intellectual tradition, as in the Islamic one, questions of political order are deeply intertwined with theological and metaphysical considerations. So, scholars are still debating whether political philosophy as like this distinct field existed in the way we understand it today.
Yeah.
And Maimonides exemplifies this kind of integration, drawing heavily on those earlier Islamic philosophical traditions.
Right.
And one interesting difference between his view and those of Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd is that while they often associated the philosopher-lawmaker with the king, Maimonides largely reserves the title of king in its fullest sense for Moses alone.
Interesting.
Envisioning an ideal polity governed by like a system of prophetic law. The Torah.
Interpreted by wise judges and scholars.
So this kind of like legal...
A very legalistic approach.
Yeah, okay. So, and the Guide of the Perplexed was also influential in Christian circles?
It was translated into Latin and made his ideas accessible to a wider audience. And its synthesis of philosophy and theology really resonated with many Christian thinkers.
Yeah, it's amazing how these different thinkers across these different traditions are all kind of expert